Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining myself and my colleague Ruth. My name's Shabana Mania. I'm a director in the employment team here at Walker Morris, and I also head up the firm's business immigration practice. I'm joined today by my colleague Ruth Jowett, who's an associate in the business immigration practice, and Ruth joined the firm from a specialist business immigration firm earlier on this year. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar on the Great Recruitment Crisis. Our sponsor licence is part of the solution. And over the next hour or so, Ruth are going to be discussing the skills shortages that are continuing to affect lots of sectors and industries across the UK, and how overseas recruitment, sponsor licences playing a large part in overseas recruitment, might form part of the solution to filling those skills shortages in the UK. You will have the opportunity to interact with us during the course of the session by way of a poll. So during the course of the session, we will be asking you a number of poll questions which will appear on your screen. And we'd be really grateful if you could take the opportunity to interact and answer those questions. Your replies won't be visible to anybody else who's on the webinar, but we will take a look at them after the event and we will circulate the replies to everybody if of interest. You will also have an opportunity to ask questions of us. So if any questions arise during the course of the session, please do feel free to use the chat function which appears on your screen to ask the question, and we'll come on to answer as many of the questions as we have time to do at the end. If we don't answer your question at the end, then don't worry, we will do our best to get back to you directly instead. Now, I think that's probably all the housekeeping out of the way, Ruth. So shall we get into the session?
Yeah, so as Shabana has mentioned, what we're going to be focusing on today is how immigration can actually help with recruitment. And this is continuing to be a really important consideration, isn't it, given the ongoing skill shortages in the UK labour market. So what do you think are the key factors affecting recruitment at the moment?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been talking about skill shortages in the UK for a number of years now. There was certainly a lot of talk around just before Brexit and immediately post-Brexit around skill shortages, and the topic just doesn't seem to be going away. And if anything, it seems to be getting worse for some sectors rather than better. And the reality is there's a whole myriad of different factors which are affecting the ability of organisations to recruit from within the UK. And the precise factors affecting each sector will probably differ, but there are a number of underlying themes that I think it's generally helpful for people to understand. The first major factor is Brexit, and it's probably going to be a long time before we can do an immigration-related webinar and not talk about Brexit. But Brexit played a massive role in the number of workers which are available to UK organisations to recruit, because before the end of the Brexit transition period at the end of December 2020, the principle of freedom of movement between the UK and the EU meant that European nationals could come to the UK and they could take up any role at any skill level for any level of pay without their employer having to engage in any kind of immigration permission. And obviously that changed at the end of December 2020. And it means employers who are now looking to recruit directly from Europe do need to engage in the immigration system. So that's played a massive impact to the number of people out there who are available to recruit directly. The other contributing factor has been COVID. So a large number of people who were in the UK working from abroad at the start of the pandemic or when the new lockdown was due to hit, returned back to their home countries for obvious reasons, and some of those didn't return. The other way COVID has played a factor is, obviously, we had a year of being in and out of lockdown and lots of normal activities weren't happening. And once lockdown was lifted, there was a surge in demand for certain products and certain services. And in some cases, that the labour force that was needed to provide those services and products was no longer there because it'd been laid off during the pandemic. So a really good example of that is the travel industry. We saw during the pandemic, lots of airlines, lots of airports laying off a large proportion of their staff. And when the consumer demand for international travel re-emerged, that staff base just wasn't there to deliver the services. And even over the course of this summer, we've seen lots of flights being cancelled. We've seen big delays at security at airports. We've seen, who can forget those images on the news of piles and piles of suitcases, and because the baggage handlers aren't there. So that's played an impact for lots of industries. The other factor to bear in mind is in the UK, we have an ageing workforce. So a third of the working population is aged 50 and over at the moment, which means inevitably there is a loss, there are more people leaving the workforce than are there ready to fill their places, and that creates a gap. In some sectors, poor pay and working conditions has been a factor. So, sectors have lost workers because they weren't deemed to be paying sufficiently, or the working conditions weren't of a sufficient standard to keep people. And all of this is against a backdrop of dropping unemployment rates in the UK. So unemployment in the UK fell to its lowest level in nearly half a century in the first quarter of 2022. So what that means is, whilst the demand for workers is ever increasing, there are just not as many people out there in the resident workforce, in the UK workforce, looking for work. So inevitably, it's going to cause this, this slight black hole. Now, what is interesting, I think, is what we've seen the government do previously in the face of skill shortages and labour recruitment challenges is relax immigration requirements. So we will all remember, especially around the time of Brexit, there was a lot of talk about taking back control of borders and reducing net migration. But actually, when we look at what the government has done in practice, just looking last year at the shortage of HGV drivers in the UK, and there was the crisis at the petrol pumps in around October with, big queues at the petrol pump because we were all scared we weren't going to get the petrol because there weren't enough HGV drivers or drivers to drive the petrol tankers around the country. And the government responded to that by introducing temporary emergency visa concessions for HGV drivers. And the same thing happened for poultry workers at the end of last year. So, when there was a dire shortage of poultry workers in the lead up to Christmas, we all needed to have our turkeys on the table for Christmas dinner. The government responded to that by introducing, a number of visas specifically geared for this sector. Looking back earlier this year, February of this year, there was special concessions made for the health and care sector. So we know there's a special visa route for health and care workers. That traditionally has only enabled highly skilled health and care workers to come into the country to work. And the government reduced the skill level to allow jobs like care workers and home care workers to come in under this visa route to be sponsored. So, we've got a skill shortage. And we've seen there's a pattern from the government of relying on migration and work-related migration to meet dire needs as and when they've arisen. But Ruth, tell us a bit more about what does the general picture look like and how are specific sectors being affected by all of this?
Yeah, so this is actually something that the British Chambers of Commerce looked into earlier this year. So they did some research and found that 1.3 million businesses were, there were 1.3 million currently unfilled vacancies, and that was in July of this year. They also surveyed a large range of businesses, I think just shy of 6,000, to see which sectors were actually being affected. And although they did say that there was clear issues across the board, the sector with the most severe difficulties it found was actually construction. So out of the businesses in that sector which were surveyed, 83% were having difficulties with recruitment. And they're not alone with those high numbers. They were shortly followed by production and manufacturing and logistics, both of which had 79% experiencing difficulties, and hospitality was on 78%, which I think we're aware is definitely something that's had struggles with Brexit and with the pandemic in terms of trying to re-recruit after these issues. So the Chambers of Commerce actually put together a 3-point action plan on how to actually tackle these issues. So this included things like investment in training, businesses offering flexible working. They said that there should actually be government input into supporting businesses and being able to, provide this training and provide these options. But thirdly, they also called for the shortage occupation list to be extended. So this is the list where if an occupation appears on the shortage occupation list, it actually makes it easier for a business to fill that role with a migrant worker. So again, there's kind of a clear focus on and understanding that the migrant workforce is going to play a role in alleviating these issues. And do you find that that's something that the government are actually listening to? Do you think they're aware of the issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, we will have all read and heard in the press over the recent weeks this move by Liz Truss towards saying increasing immigration is going to be an important part in filling these 1.3 million job vacancies you just referred to, and to boosting economic growth. So the government is talking a lot at the moment about economic growth. And the reality is delivering that objective of improving economic growth against the backdrop of industries that are struggling to fill the jobs, probably isn't going to happen. So the Prime Minister definitely seems to be on board with the idea that it needs to be made easier for certain industries to bring skilled workers into the UK. Having said that, immigration generally and work-related immigration included in that has always been a political hot potato, and the Prime Minister has faced quite fierce opposition from within her own party when she's talked about making it easier to bring skilled workers into the UK. We heard at the Conservative Party conference a couple of weeks ago, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, actually talking about trying to limit net migration, and quite surprisingly, she talked about dependent visas and people who are here as dependents and whether or not it was right for them to be able to take low-skilled work in the UK. So there is a tension in the government at the moment. It's generally that's not uncommon. But I think there are three key aspects which we can probably expect updates and some kind of movement from the government on, which we all need to watch out for. The first is the Migration Advisory Committee. You just mentioned about the shortage occupation list. So the government has instructed the Migration Advisory Committee to look at the current shortage occupation list and specifically to consider whether additional roles should be included on the list. So as you mentioned, the shortage occupation list is a list of occupations where there is an acute need, and it's easier for employers to bring people in under the shortage occupation list, primarily because the salary requirements are around 20% lower than they would otherwise be. So the Migration Advisory Committee is going to report on this and report on which other sectors should be included. And that really presents an opportunity for sectors who are suffering from severe shortages to lobby the government and to try and get their sectors included, or roles within their sectors included, on the shortage occupation list. The MAC is due to report back in March of next year, so there is still some time for that. Specifically, the Prime Minister has been talking about the telecoms sector as one which would benefit from having additional skilled workers being allowed to come into the UK. So there's been mention of broadband engineers potentially falling within the shortage occupation list. And that's against the government's commitment to increase the spread of fibre optic broadband throughout the UK. It's recognised that it can't do that if there aren't enough broadband engineers to do the work, and therefore that's a specific role that's being targeted, but no doubt there will be many others. The second thing I think we can expect an update on is the English language requirement. So at the moment, anybody coming into the UK under the skilled worker route has to satisfy the Home Office that they can speak, read, write English to at least level B1 on the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So that made sense when it was only highly skilled roles that were suitable for sponsorship. But what we saw at the beginning of 2021 was a reduction in the skills thresholds from what was previously degree level to A level and above. And it means effectively there are now more skilled manual roles that are suitable for sponsorship under the skilled worker route. And not all of those need to have English language proficiency to the same extent. So that's another area the government is potentially looking at. The third area, which might prove of assistance to employers, is a review of the high potential individual route. So some of our viewers might be familiar with this route that was introduced earlier on this year. The idea was that the government recognised a list of 50 top global universities, and recent graduates from those top 50 global universities are able to apply for a visa that enables them to come to the UK to work for up to 2 years without sponsorship. Now, unfortunately, it just so happened that the vast majority of the top 50 universities across the world happen to be in North America. There were none whatsoever, for example, in India, which is the country from which the largest proportion of skilled workers are recruited from at the moment. So the government is looking to extend that top 50 list to a top 100 list to try and broaden the range of recent graduates who are able to come to the UK without sponsorship. The other area the government is looking at the moment is the seasonal agriculture route. So we know that at the moment there's a specific route which is open to agricultural workers, horticultural workers, the likes of seasonal fruit pickers who come into the UK, and the vast majority of those labourers will be people coming into the UK to do the work under this visa route. The government is talking about increasing the cap on those numbers, and that will be of assistance to some, to a specific sector. But I think regardless of what the end result is, and regardless of what the precise nature of the changes is, what is clear is that there is a firm intention by this government to use skill migration as part of the problem to tackling skill shortages. And I think now would be a really good time to ask our first poll question of the audience. So hopefully the question should appear on your screen now, which is your business experiencing difficulties with recruiting into skilled roles? So if people could take a few seconds to answer that question, that would be much appreciated. Okay, moving on, Ruth. We've touched upon sponsor licenses, and sponsor licenses being a requirement before a business can bring a skilled worker into the UK. What exactly is a sponsor license, and how does a company go about getting one?
Yeah, so if an employer wants to employ a overseas migrant, in most cases now they're going to need a sponsor license. So, as you touched on, post-Brexit, this also means the majority of EU nationals, so people coming to the UK since the end of the transition period, if they want to work in the UK, again, they're likely to need a sponsor to actually sponsor their visa in the UK. So to be able to be eligible for a sponsor license, you must be a organisation in the UK, so a genuine organisation. You must be operating lawfully in the UK, and you must be capable of carrying out some sponsor duties. So this is a really important aspect of sponsorship, in that the Home Office is very clear that sponsorship is a privilege and not a right. So those organisations that are going to benefit from being a sponsor and being able to employ migrant workers also have a hand in actually ensuring that the immigration system isn't abused. So in terms of the sponsor licence itself, when a company has a licence, what they can then do is assign a certificate of sponsorship to any individual that they want to actually fill one of their vacancies. When they've done that, that allows a worker to actually then apply for a visa to either come to the UK or for further leave to remain in the UK with the right to work in that specific role that you needed filling. The sponsor will be able to manage its licence through something called the sponsor management system. So that's a kind of online account that you will have access to just when your licence gets granted. So within that account, you can do things like apply for certificates when you do have a vacancy that you need to fill, assign those to specific individuals, but also make reports and different things that we can touch on, I think, a bit later. But there are also a number of different types of licence. So which do you think are the ones that employers are most looking to use at the moment to help with these issues.
Yeah, definitely, you're right. There are a number of different routes, and we wouldn't have time to touch upon them all in this session. But the two that are most commonly used are the skilled worker route and the global business mobility senior or specialist worker route. The other thing, I suppose, to bear in mind before you even necessarily decided which routes and you're going to go down with the licence is how, as an organisation, you're going to structure the licence. So the Home Office is open to companies structuring the licence in a way that reflects their business. So if you are an organisation with lots of different branches, lots of different sites, offices, UK subsidiaries, etc., you can choose to have all of those on one licence, or you can choose to have a separate licence for each branch or subsidiary. And there are pros and cons to each approach, but that's something which organisations need to think about. They then need to decide which categories of licence do we need. And as we've mentioned, skilled worker is the one that is most commonly used in order for UK organisations to directly employ somebody from overseas into a genuine vacancy in the UK that meets the relevant skills and salary thresholds. Now, this idea of a genuine vacancy is important. So you can't assign a certificate of sponsorship to somebody to come over for any role. It has to be a genuine vacancy that meets the requirements. And the Home Office defines a genuine vacancy as one which genuinely the individual has a need to do the duties that are set out in the job description, and those duties meet the relevant requirements. The individual isn't going to be doing any duties that are below the skills threshold, so you can't employ somebody as a HR director, but then them actually be carrying out administrative functions. They need to be acting in that HR director role, for example. And if there is a job description that is artificially made to look more complicated, or the duties are artificially inflated to make them meet skills thresholds, then that isn't deemed to be genuine. And in particular, if a vacancy is created specifically for the purposes of enabling a particular individual to come into the UK, that isn't considered genuine either. Once a skilled worker licence is held, there is no limit on the number of skilled workers an organisation is able to sponsor, provided that each of those individuals meets the requirements for the visa and that each of the roles meets the relevant skills and salary thresholds. And individuals are eligible to come into the UK for up to 5 years at a time. So you could sponsor somebody for 2 years, 3 years, but it's a maximum of 5 years. After 5 years, you can then opt to extend their sponsorship, or more commonly what happens is individuals who have been in the UK for 5 years as a skilled worker are then eligible to apply for what's known as indefinite leave to remain. And that basically gives them the indefinite right to live and work in the UK without the need for sponsorship. And that's really good news for both employers and the individual, because the employer then needs to worry about all the sponsor duties and obligations that come with being a sponsor to that individual, which we'll come on to look at. But can you just tell us a bit more about the other route that I mentioned, Ruth, the senior or specialist worker route?
Yeah, so this route falls within the kind of umbrella of global business mobility. So this was introduced earlier this year, but does replace the route that some of our attendees may already be aware of, which was Tier 2 intercompany transfer. And where this route differs really is that, so as we say, it's, as by name, it's senior or specialist workers, and they need to be coming from an overseas company that's actually linked to the UK sponsoring organisation. So that link can be by common ownership or control, they can be party to a joint venture, but the employee themselves must have been employed at that overseas company. Generally, they need to have been employed for at least 12 months overseas before they're able to transfer to the UK. In some circumstances, you can avoid that. So, for example, if they're a high earner, earning, I think, £73,900 per annum in the UK, then it doesn't matter how long they've been employed overseas. They do still need to be employed, but that 12-month requirement is waived. So the skill and salary threshold for this route are actually higher than skilled worker. So I think we'll touch on it in a bit more detail shortly. But, you know, as the name suggests, this really is focused on senior and specialist workers coming to the UK for short or long-term assignments, to help, with the UK business as part of the, the global group. Unlike skilled worker, this doesn't lead to settlement. So as you were saying, under the skilled worker route, if you're here for 5 years, then that person can apply for definite leave to remain. That's not the case here. So again, a focus on, short, long-term assignments. It's not for somebody to move here permanently to the UK. Under this global business mobility, similarly, we do have the graduate trainee route, which is, a similar type of route, but focused much more on graduates coming to do placements at a group, at a company in the UK that again has a group overseas. So those two kind of tie in quite neatly together. So I think at this point we'll ask our second poll question. So again, hopefully this should be coming up on your screen, and we just want to check, does your business already have a sponsor license? Again, just give you a few seconds to answer that. Okay, thank you. So Shabana, we touched there on the fact that there's a skill and salary requirement for these two routes and that they actually differ. Could you give a bit more information to us on that?
Yeah, so in order for a role to be eligible for sponsorship, it's not all roles. You can't sponsor somebody to do any job. You need to check and do your due diligence on whether or not the role is actually eligible. There are minimum skills requirements and minimum salary thresholds that have to be met. In terms of the skill requirements, currently under the skilled worker route, the skill requirement is RQF level 3 and above, which equates to A level and above. Now, before the changes to the immigration rules that came in at the beginning of January 2021, it was actually RQF level 6 for skilled worker, or the predecessor to skilled worker, which was degree level and above. So you can see there's already been quite a dramatic drop in the skill level from a job needing to have to be A level, to be degree level and above, down to A level and above in order to qualify. And I know we'll look in a bit more detail at some examples of roles that are suitable for qualification, but it does mean for any of our viewers watching, if you've looked at sponsoring for a particular role a few years ago and discounted it as a possibility because the role wasn't sufficiently skilled, you may well look now and find that exact role is capable of being sponsored now because the skill level is that much lower. For senior or specialist worker, the skill level is still RQF level 6, so degree level and above. And like you mentioned earlier, the clue is in the name. This is designed for senior or specialist workers, and they have to be that much more coming in for a role that is that much more skilled to qualify. It's important to remember, it's not that the individual you're looking to sponsor necessarily needs to hold a qualification that is equivalent to an A-level or a degree. It's just that the role needs to have that level of skill attributed to it. It might be that the individual needs a qualification for other reasons, but not to meet this particular requirement. In terms of the salary then, so once you're satisfied that the role, you've got the role in mind, you've done your due diligence, you've checked that it's sufficiently skilled, next question is it sufficiently well paid? There are two concepts to bear in mind here. The first is a general salary threshold, which has to be met in all cases. And then there is what's known as the going rate for each particular type of role, depending on which occupation code it falls into. And I know you'll talk a bit about occupation codes. And you have to pay the higher of the two. So where the going rate for the role is higher than the general salary threshold, you have to meet the higher going rate. And to be fair, in the majority of cases, the going rate is going to be higher, certainly for the more skilled roles. So the general salary threshold is £25,600 per year for skilled worker. And the general salary threshold for senior or specialist worker is £42,400 per year. So quite a significant jump there for the two. And sometimes that can be the deciding factor between, do you go down the skilled worker route or do you go down the senior or specialist worker route? Because you might have somebody who is employed overseas in a group company and has been for 12 months. And so they'd be eligible under the senior or specialist worker route, but actually the role they're coming to do isn't sufficiently well paid, and therefore you opt for skilled worker instead, and you do have that flexibility within the rules to make that decision. Other thing to bear in mind with salaries is if you are using other payments like bonuses, commissions, housing allowances, etc., to form part of the salary package, that isn't going to be allowed in the skilled worker route. So you need to be looking at really base salary for skilled worker at that level. Slightly different for senior or specialist worker. There's a wider range of additional types of remuneration that can be taken into account. If you have somebody who you're interested in sponsoring and the role doesn't meet the salary requirement, in certain circumstances, the salary requirement is reduced even further. I think the absolute minimum it can be is £20,480. And that will depend on whether or not the individual is eligible for what are known as tradable points. So if, for example, the individual is considered to be a new entrant to the labour force, so that's somebody who is 26 years old and under, then they will be eligible for a lower salary. If they have a PhD qualification, which is relevant to their job, or a PhD qualification in a STEM subject, which is relevant to their job, then they are eligible for a reduction in the salary. And similarly, if the role they're coming to the UK to do falls within the shortage occupation list, they are eligible for a reduction in the salary. So it's always worth just making those additional inquiries if you're not sure on, at first glance, whether or not the salary requirements will actually be met.
Yeah, I think it's the same with health and some education.
Yeah, exactly.
As well.
So the same for for some healthcare roles and education roles, lower salary requirements. And Ruth, clients often come to us, don't they, presenting us with a job title and sometimes a job description and asking, can we sponsor this job? Just explain, for the benefit of the people watching today, how do we go about determining whether or not a particular role is eligible?
Yeah, so it can be one of the trickier points to iron out in the sponsorship process. So I guess start with the reason it's required. So for each sponsored worker, like we say, they'll need a certificate of sponsorship. On that certificate, you have to provide the job title, the job description, but it's also the sponsor's responsibility to choose an occupation code. So these occupation codes are set out in the immigration rules, so Appendix skilled occupation, and all of the ones that are eligible for sponsorship will be listed in that appendix. And it's also important to check that, all of the ones listed will be eligible for skilled worker. You have to double check if they're also eligible for, the higher skilled senior or specialist worker. But yeah, so you can check on there. So to figure out which code we want to use, the first thing we want to do is check a detailed job description. So this should include the job title, but also the types of duties that person's going to be doing, and also the skills and experience, the qualifications that the business is expecting the person who fills that vacancy to have. So we'll have a look at the job description, and what we'll do is compare that against, firstly, the occupation codes and the immigration rules, but we'll also use the ONS coding tool. So this is a really helpful tool because what you can do is put your occupation code in, and what that brings up is examples of job titles, but also job duties that a Home Office caseworker is going to look at when assessing what they think should fall under each code. So, it's not always, unfortunately, straightforward. So we'll have some roles that, it's very obvious, it's a solicitor, there's a legal professionals code, easy job. With others that are more an amalgamation of things, it can become more difficult. So, you might have someone that's in IT and marketing or science and engineering, and their role, combines a few different things. I think the important thing to focus on is that there's no requirement to pick a code that, completely matches exactly everything you're going to do. What you do have responsibility to do is pick the most appropriate. So, that's the real focus. as well, we want to, avoid any red flags to the Home Office. So we know what they don't like to see is if you have a really high skilled role, what you've set out in the job description shows it's someone really senior, but then you've picked a lower skilled occupation code simply because it has a lower salary threshold. You want to be able to, pay the person slightly lower than what you might have to under the higher skilled occupation. And then on the flip side, if you have a lower skilled role that actually wouldn't be RQF level 3, wouldn't meet, one of the codes that is eligible, but you pick one that's, a bit closer and actually higher up in the list, so it becomes eligible. If, the job that that person's doing in practice doesn't meet that, then, that's a big problem looking at whether or not it's a genuine vacancy and, can cause issues for the sponsor later down the line. In terms of, looking at the candidate themselves, we often like to look at a CV. Again, just checking that genuine vacancy point, making sure that if the job's been advertised and says, we need somebody with a degree in a relevant subject, and the person you've chosen, has never worked in this type of role before, doesn't have a degree, it's again things that could be picked up by the Home Office. So we need to make sure that we're ironing out at the very early stages. In terms of the types of roles that are eligible for sponsorship, it's across all sectors now. There is a real variety of roles. So, if we're looking at the sectors which have been struggling with recruitment, so we have healthcare. Obviously, we're looking at doctors, surgeons, dental practitioners, but also nurses, midwives, some care roles, as you say, have now been added. In the construction industry, so there's things like construction project managers, quality control and planning engineers, building and civil engineering technicians, all eligible for sponsorship. And in hospitality, chefs, restaurant managers, hotel managers, all eligible for sponsorship to help with those issues. When we have people looking at the senior or specialist worker route, it does tend to be on, more higher skilled roles. So things like chief executives, marketing and sales directors, they're often the types of roles that people want to move from an overseas group company temporarily to the UK to, help establish the company here. And again, I think worth noting when you mentioned that the skill level for skilled worker has gone down to RQF level 3, this really has opened up the door to a lot more occupation codes. So, now we're looking at things like electricians, sales administrators, bar managers, all roles that weren't eligible, in 2020 that since last year have now been added. So it's, as you say, it's definitely worth checking. If, you thought something wasn't eligible previously, it's worth checking that if the changes have actually opened up sponsorship as an option for you. So, we've reviewed the job description, we've chosen an occupation code, we're happy that the skill and salary levels are met. What are the first steps that a business actually needs to think about to be able to sponsor somebody?
So the first thing that they need to think about, obviously, is whether or not they've got the sponsor licence in place. And if they haven't, the very first stage in the process is to make an application for the sponsor licence. Before the company submits the application, so the application is made online, there's a bit of homework to be done. The first thing they probably need to be thinking about is who are going to be the key personnel under the licence. So the key personnel are a number of designated roles that the Home Office requires the organisation to fill with somebody who's employed in the organisation for the lifetime of the licence. The key ones being the authorising officer, the key contact and the level 1 user. And there are various criteria that apply to whether or not an individual is going to be eligible for these roles. For example, if they've ever held the role previously at an organisation which received illegal working penalties, they may not be eligible. If they've got criminal convictions, if they've ever been disqualified as acting as a director, they won't be eligible. So first thing to think about is who is going to be responsible within our organisation for actually running and managing this sponsor licence, because we need to provide those details to the Home Office, and the Home Office will run background checks against them. The company also needs to be looking at the supporting documents that are submitted with the application. So the application form itself is an online application form. It's relatively straightforward to fill out in terms of information about the company and its structure and how many branches it has, etc. But the trickier part can often be the supporting documents. There are a number of mandatory documents that have to be submitted within a very strict 5 working day time frame of the online application form being submitted. So we'd always advise get the supporting documents sorted out before the online form is submitted, because it will always take more than 5 working days, or in my experience, it's always taken more than 5 working days to get the supporting documentation and information ready. And with the documentation, what the Home Office is looking for is that the organisation is genuinely lawfully operating in the UK. It has a genuine need for the sponsor licence. And it will be things like bank statements, the latest corporate bank statements, VAT certificate, evidence of registration for PAYE, evidence of employer liability insurance being in place, evidence of business premises, whether owned or leased. And whilst all of that sounds relatively straightforward, and the Home Office does now accept scanned copies of documents, which is a relatively recent pandemic change. Before, pre-pandemic, it had to be either original documents or certified copies of original documents. So whilst you can submit scanned copies with your application, the Home Office reserves the right to inspect original documents. So any organisation applying for a sponsor licence should only use documentation in support of the application where the original is available. Now, if you think back to a company that registered for VAT 15 years ago, the chances of the original VAT certificate lying around to be found easily are probably quite slim. So sometimes it means having to apply to HMRC for a further copy of the certificate. Similarly with business premises, if a lease of premises or the ownership deeds were entered into 20, 30 years ago, the chances are they're not going to be readily accessible. So, it can easily take a good few weeks, if not a month or more sometimes, to get all the supporting documents in order. Also, bear in mind that the UKVI is very prescriptive about the format of the documents that are scanned to it. So if the documents are not in the acceptable format, the application will be rejected and you will have to start all over again. So clients are sometimes very eager to submit the application in haste, but it just isn't worth their while, because if you spend an extra week getting the documentation right, your application will be processed that much faster than if the Home Office has to come back to you and ask more questions, or they reject your application and you have to start all over again. So that's kind of the main application process, is the online application and then submit your supporting documents. If the organisation has already identified a particular worker for sponsorship, then they also need to provide details of that worker, of the role that they want to sponsor. And it may well be that as part of the consideration of the application, the Home Office does a compliance check. A compliance check can be done either physically or more commonly now digitally. And the Home Office is going to be looking for things like HR systems being in place, which enable the organisation to monitor, to track each individual migrant worker and report on them if necessary. They'll be looking at things like the organisation's compliance with immigration requirements more generally. So as an organisation, do you do proper right to work checks? Do you have proper checks of right to work for all individuals, not just sponsored migrants? So it's really important before an organisation puts pen to paper with their application, it makes sure that everything in the background is as it needs to be, so that if the Home Office does come knocking to do a check, either during the application or any time during the life of the licence, everything is in order and there is no reason for the Home Office to reject the application. And the final point I would make on this is a really stressful exercise for HR managers or recruitment managers to have to go through when there is an urgent business need for somebody to be in the UK filling a post yesterday, which is often the case. And we've worked with lots of people in that situation where the business is breathing down their neck, saying, we need this person in the UK next month, and it just can't be delivered because certain factors are outside of our control in terms of timescales. And that's why I think it's really important for any organisation that thinks it might need to use the sponsor licence in the future to make the application, get the licence application in preemptively. Used to be the case that the Home Office wouldn't accept a sponsor licence application unless you had a particular migrant worker in mind. That's now changed. They encourage preemptive applications, and that's what I would always recommend, because it's not pretty having to do all of this under time constraints. And talking about time constraints, Ruth, what is a realistic time frame for an organisation to make the application and obtain the licence?
Yeah, so as you say, unfortunately, it's not necessarily a quick process. So the lead-in time, as you say, making sure you have the documents, making sure the application's ready, we would generally recommend at least 1 month for that, that initial process. When the application has actually been submitted to the Home Office, so the online form has gone, the supporting documents have gone, the standard processing is 8 weeks. But this can vary. So we've seen recently there's been delays across all Home Office processing as they've moved teams around to deal with the situation in the Ukraine, and looking, more focused on dealing with those visa applications coming from people fleeing there. But it has had a knock-on effect in delays. So things like sponsor licence applications have actually taken up to 10 weeks. We are seeing it move back down, but it does just show that it is variable. There is a priority service. So, earlier this year that was suspended. It's now been reintroduced and actually extended to more applicants again. So what the priority service does, if you can get it, is expedite the processing to within 10 working days. So the Home Office will only accept 30 applications per day for this service. So it's not guaranteed that the first time you send your request that you're going to get it, but you aren't stopped from reapplying until you do have that. So if you do have that urgent need and you do need somebody in the country yesterday, then that's definitely something that we would advise considering, bearing in mind that it does come in with additional cost. So you'd be expected to pay a further £500 to actually put your application onto that tract. So I guess speaking of costs, it is something that is important consideration for someone looking to sponsor. What sort of costs are we looking at?
Yeah, absolutely, Ruth. And I think we're always clear with clients that sponsorship isn't a cheap process. There are costs involved, and to some extent they can be quite significant. But the conversation I often find myself having with clients is the cost of sponsorship, when you compare that against the cost to the business of having a vacancy unfulfilled for potentially months on end if you don't sponsor somebody from overseas, or the cost of losing a client contract because you don't have the resources to meet the contract, or just in some cases not even bothering to tender for a contract because you've not got the workforce to deliver on it, then all of a sudden the costs start looking a bit more palatable. It's always also worth bearing in mind that if you as an organisation sponsor an individual for a 5-year skilled worker visa, that person moves to the UK, that's quite a lifestyle commitment for that individual. Often they will move with family, and that person's eligibility to live and work in the UK is then contingent upon their employment with you as their sponsoring organisation continuing. Now, yes, it's open to them to go away and find themselves another sponsor in the UK, but that isn't always easy. So in that context, I think what sponsoring workers does to some extent is help with workforce planning, because if you sponsor somebody for 5 years, there's a good chance that they are then going to be with you for 5 years, as opposed to somebody who isn't sponsored, who is free to come and go at will. So I always think those considerations are worth bearing in mind when you're thinking about costs. But in terms of the costs themselves, the costs will differ depending on the size and charitable status of the organisation. If your company classes as a medium or large size organisation under the Companies Act definition, then the cost of the actual sponsor licence application itself is £1,476 for a 4-year licence. Every time you assign a certificate of sponsorship to an individual, or in the vast majority of circumstances, there are some exceptions, you will pay a fee of £199 for signing the certificate. The more significant costs are the immigration skills charge, which is £1,000 a year per year of sponsorship per sponsored worker if you're a large organisation. So if you think you're sponsoring somebody for 5 years, that's £5,000 in immigration skills charge, and that's effectively a tax on employers payable to the government for the privilege of bringing workers into the UK. The individual is then responsible for visa application fees, and these can vary from just shy of £500 to just shy of £1,500, depending on the type of sponsorship and whether they're making the application in the UK and outside the UK. And on top of that, there's what's known as the immigration health surcharge, which is a levy on the individual, which enables them to use the National Health Service free at the point of service, and that's £624 per year of the visa. So we can see the costs can quite quickly mount up. The immigration skills charge has to be paid by the employer. Sponsor can't ask the individual to pay that cost. The other fees are payable by the individual, but often in practice what you'll see is a commercial arrangement that has been entered into whereby the sponsor will pay all of the fees, and then in some circumstances there might be a repayment of fees agreement whereby you say, look, if you leave our organisation within a year, then X percentage of the fees are repayable. If you leave within 2 years, Y percentage are repayable. That kind of agreement needs to be carefully drafted to make sure it's enforceable, but it is an option. So, you know, as we can see, there is a cost involved with this, definitely. But you touched upon, Ruth, earlier, the fact that, you know, employers are given the ability to some extent to police the UK borders, because you as employers, as sponsors, are then deciding whether somebody is eligible for sponsorship and bringing them over. Presumably the Home Office expects you to fulfil certain duties as a result of that. Can you just talk us through briefly what those are?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I say, it's, you know, seen as a privilege, not a right, to be a sponsor. And so with that comes a lot of duties and responsibilities, and they can be quite onerous. So, you know, someone looking to become a sponsor really needs to have a look and consider whether or not they're, you know, up to keeping up with these duties if they want to proceed with sponsorship. So the range of duties can actually be found in more detail in the sponsor guidance. So part 3 of the sponsor guidance, the Home Office guidance to sponsors, does set out in detail exactly all the duties and responsibilities, and we really would recommend that anybody interested or anyone that has a sponsor licence make sure that they read that. But as an overview, I guess, there's a number of reporting duties. So things to do with the sponsored worker themselves usually have to be reported within 10 days. Things to do with the organisation, you know, a change in name or address has to be reported within 20 days. There are also some record keeping duties, making sure that for each sponsored worker you keep those documents on file in case the Home Office want to check them, and then just wider duties like keeping, making sure that you comply with immigration and UK laws more widely. But yes, I suppose we've kind of covered the sponsor licence element of this. When someone has a sponsor licence, what can they do then to get someone to the UK?
Yeah, so that's a good point, because I think sometimes employers think having a sponsor licence is the end, you know, that's it. Once you've got the sponsor licence, you're free to bring people in. The individual still needs to have a skilled worker or a senior or specialist worker visa, and they need to apply for that visa. They can't make the application until they have the certificate of sponsorship from the employer, but there is often some background information or background work that can be done before you get to that stage to expedite the process. So the individual may need to satisfy a financial requirement to prove that they can maintain themselves for their first month in the UK, if their employer, if the sponsor isn't willing to certify that. So they need to gather that information together. Nationals from certain countries need to have a TB test certificate to prove that they are free of tuberculosis at the point they enter the UK. That can take a bit of time to obtain. Nationals who are citizens of non-English majority speaking countries will also need to satisfy an English language requirement. We touched upon that earlier. So that is done in a number of different ways. If they have studied in the UK, they might be able to rely on their UK degree certificate. If they've studied for a degree at bachelor's level or above outside the UK, but in English, then there is an external process that they can go through with an organisation called ECTIS to verify that the degree is equivalent to a UK bachelor's degree. And failing all of that, they might need to sit an English language test, and there is generally a wait of between 2 and 3 weeks. It depends on whereabouts in the world they're sitting the test, but it can easily be 2 or 3 weeks before that English language test can be sat. So all of this background work can be being done at the same time as a sponsor license application in advance of the person submitting their application. The individual then submits an online visa application. They then have to attend, in the vast majority of cases, a biometric appointment to submit their biometrics. That can take 2 or 3 weeks to obtain. And once their biometrics have been submitted, they then have a standard processing time of 3 weeks for the visa to be processed. It's currently running at more like 4 weeks. But if there is an urgent need, it's possible generally to pay extra to have the process expedited. But you can see there's a process to follow and timeframes to bear in mind. And just very quickly, Ruth, in the last few minutes, before we go on to take a couple of questions, if we have time, because I can see lots of questions have been coming in as we've been speaking. Not all organisations will have a sponsor licence. Does that mean they can close their eyes to all kinds of visa applications and not worry about visas at all? Or might they still come across people who have other kinds of visas?
Yeah, so there are a number of other visas in the UK that do still have a right to work, even if they're not sponsored. So, you know, in particular, we see students have a right to work part-time in term time and then full-time in holidays. Also, business visitor can be helpful if someone's coming not to do substantive paid work in the UK, but for, you know, a short period for a permitted activity. There's a number of other routes, you know, graduate, high potential individual, UK ancestry, global talent, youth mobility. All of these routes, you know, have the right to work in the UK, but don't need sponsorship. So, you know, it's still a consideration.
Excellent, that's really helpful. Thank you, Ruth. And I think that takes us to our last poll question, which is, do you anticipate that your business may need to recruit from overseas in the future? So if our audience could take a minute or so just to answer that last poll question, that would be very much appreciated. Great, thank you, everybody. And we're literally down to the last minute. So we'll take one of the questions that's come through. Ruth, I think if you could answer this one. We have a senior or specialist worker licence for our group company in India, but a different group company in the US needs to send an employee over. Can we use the same licence or do we need a new one?
So it doesn't necessarily need to be a separate licence, but you need to make sure that that overseas company is listed as one of the connected companies on the licence that you have. So if you applied recently, that may actually be shown within the SMS. But if you applied for your licence when it was under the Tier 2 route, what you're going to have to do is probably go back and check the application documents at the time, just to make sure that that branch, you know, is included. And if it isn't, it can be added, but that step would need to happen, or you can get the person here.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, we have got plenty of other questions. Unfortunately, we've run out of time to answer them all now. But as I said at the beginning, we will do our best to come back to you individually if we've not got round to answering your question. Thank you for sending those in. There are some really interesting ones there. That's taken us to 1 o'clock exactly, which is the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you found it informative. And if you have any further questions after the event, by all means, feel free to pick up the phone or drop Ruth or I an email, and we're more than happy to chat them through with you. We will be circulating a recording of the webinar. If anybody is inclined to watch it again, you're more than welcome to do so. I personally would recommend Netflix, but you know, to each their own. But if you want to share it with colleagues, or if you want to use it for future reference, then by all means do so. And thank you once again, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.